In the last year of World War II, two gigantic armies charge across Northern Europe to pummel Nazi Germany into submission.
It's a headlong race between the largest armies ever assembled in human history.
On one side, the Soviet Red Army. On the other side, the army of the Western Allies. Their target? Hitler's Berlin.
If you get Berlin, you are the victors of the war in Europe.
The race is on, and the stakes could not be higher.
Berlin is the control lever, the gateway to controlling the center of Europe. And if you control the center of Europe, you control the whole continent.
But it's a prize with a massive cost.
The devastation, the bloodshed is just simply unbelievable. It completely changes world history.
Each army must travel 700 miles to stop a madman. 700 miles for victory, 700 miles to control the future of Europe and the world.
What happens and how it plays out are still being felt, even now.
In the early years of World War II, Hitler's armies conquer most of Europe. But in 1942, the tide turns. And by the summer of 1944, Germany is in trouble and the Allies are closing in. But Hitler will not yield.
Even at this stage of the war, Hitler still has this complete grip on Nazi Germany.
Toppling Hitler all depends on the number 3. Of the alliance of nations that come together to oppose Nazi Germany, 3 countries will determine the outcome of the war and the future of Europe.
Of course, there are other countries involved as well, but the big 3, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, are the most important.
The big 3 confer: Roosevelt, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin.
The strength of the alliance of these 3 nations is vital, but they're not exactly best buddies.
They're tactical allies for the sake of winning the war. But the relationship between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union is far better characterized by, frankly, hatred in a lot of ways.
Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who sentenced 1 million of his own people to death during the Great Purge, has a bit of an image problem.
Stalin is a despotic dictator. He's an absolute monster.
UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in particular, has no love for the man or his politics.
Churchill's view was that Stalin was a really disgusting, horrible figure. Churchill was decidedly anti-communist. He was absolutely against the political Sovietization of Central and Eastern Europe.
Stalin, for his part, has more than 8 million reasons to resent his Western partners. Since 1941, Stalin and the Soviet Union have done the majority of the fighting against Hitler's army. It's been a bloodbath. 8.1 million members of his Red Army are dead, missing, or taken prisoner. 10 times what the USA and the UK will suffer over the entire war combined.
Now, Stalin is furious about this, and Stalin's view is we're really doing all the heavy lifting here, and it's about time that the Western Allies did something as well.
Now, he's finally going to get his wish. The Western Allies, the United States, the UK, and Canada, have plans to launch an unprecedented invasion into France from the west. Meanwhile, Stalin's Red Army continues to push from the east, and the end goal for everyone is the same.
Berlin is the target, the lair of the fascist beast.
Each side will fight through about 700 miles of heavily defended enemy territory. If you walked non-stop, you could cover that distance in 183 hours. It will take these armies 11 months, an average of 0.09 miles per hour, or about half the speed of a sloth.
Nobody's expecting this to be easy. The Germans are notorious for their defense, notorious for fighting back.
But this is not just a fight against two fronts of Hitler's Reich. It's a competition between East and West for a much bigger prize.
On the one hand, there are smiles and agreements, but both sides are actively preparing for what comes next. Really, it's very much an ideological contest between Soviet communism versus capitalism and democracy, with Berlin being the center of that objective.
The race to Berlin is the competition, in a way, between the Western Allies and the Soviets to get to Berlin before the other side does, winning the right to impose your political system.
The race is set. Each side will have 6 months to build up their strength before the coordinated assault begins. The Soviet Red Army will be directed by none other than Stalin himself, since the ruthless dictator has some trust issues. 23,000 of them.
Stalin doesn't trust anyone on the planet. You know, he's suspicious of everybody. I mean, anyone who kills 23,000 officers in his army before the outbreak of the Second World War, that's pretty paranoid.
Commanding the Western Front is General Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower is a much different leader than Stalin. People actually like Ike.
Eisenhower is a really good man. You know, he's decent, he's honorable, so they're quite different characters.
On the eve of the Allied invasion of Europe, there's a big number on Ike's mind, 50%. It's at the heart of the most difficult decision he will make in the war. As an ambulance driver during the London Blitz, Kay Summersby witnessed the darkest days of the war. Now, 3 years later, on the evening of June 5th, 1944, the 35-year-old is driving General Eisenhower's staff car out to Greenham Common Airfield.
Eisenhower decides to go to Greenham Common, where the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, are about to make the trip over to Normandy.
Eisenhower made a point of going and seeing most units in his army as much as he possibly can, which is quite unusual for a senior commander.
A nurse tries to hand the general a cup of coffee, but his hands are shaking too much to hold it. In the months leading up to today, Ike's been so on edge, he's smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day.
The weight of responsibility on his shoulders is just absolutely immense. This is the burden of high command.
Walking among the 1,430 paratroopers, Eisenhower stops to speak with Lieutenant Wallace Strobel, jump master for plane number 23. They don't talk about the fact that the entire war hinges on this mission. Instead, they talk about fishing. Today is Strobel's birthday. The young man from Michigan has just turned 22. For him and the entire 101st Airborne, this will be their first combat deployment. In fact, only 4% of all invasion force divisions have seen combat.
Someone like Eisenhower, a humane man who values the lives of every single young soldier that is going into battle, he's inevitably going to be wondering how many of them are going to be alive the following morning.
As Eisenhower and Summersby watch the 81 transport planes disappear into the clouds, Summersby notices that the general has a tear in his eye. Ike has been told that approximately 50% of paratroopers will likely die before they hit the ground. The survival of Lieutenant Strobel and everyone else on those planes has the odds of a coin toss. But the plan goes ahead. Before dawn, the assault begins, and in typical American fashion, it's over the top. 17,000 soldiers drop from the sky. But that's just the beginning. The main assault comes by sea.
The scale of D-Day is just absolutely gigantic. It includes 1,213 warships, 4,127 landed craft. It includes 155,000 men just on that first day. This is on a scale that has never been seen before. It is the biggest single amphibious invasion ever in the history of the world.
And it all starts with one step. By the dawn light, 20 landing craft cut the waves in a straight shot for a distant beach. Inside the landing craft, 22 young American soldiers are crunched together.
It was terrible weather, so basically they're just crashing over high seas.
80% of them are seasick. They've been riding through rough waves for 2 hours. When the boat ramp drops open, Captain Leonard Max Schroeder is the first one out. They've arrived at 6:28 a.m., 2 minutes early, and they're still 100 yards from shore.
So, you know, he wades into the water. He's got his Colt 45. He's waving it above his head and leading his men on.
Weighed down by 80 pounds of equipment, Max surges forward, leading his men to shore.
In the early hours of D-Day, he is the first man to put his foot down on French sand.
It's step number 1 in the race to Berlin. And the starter's pistol is an explosion of gunfire from entrenched German positions up the beach.
Hell is unleashed. The bullets start whizzing by and the explosions, and you got nowhere to hide.
Max is hit twice in the left arm and side. But the 25-year-old keeps fighting. By the afternoon of June 6th, he and his men have done their job. They have secured the beach. Captain Schroeder survives to fight another day. But many aren't so lucky. Of the estimated 10,000 Allied casualties on D-Day, 4,414 men lost their lives. Despite the losses, the D-Day landings are a success.
The most important thing when you're launching an amphibious invasion is that it doesn't fail.
The Western Allies are off to a great start. But on the Eastern Front, Stalin is seething. He's got 30 million reasons to be out for vengeance. Stalin and Hitler had been allies, but in 1941, Hitler, being Hitler, betrays Stalin.
When the blow came, it was from 5 different directions.
Stalin was absolutely shocked when Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and Hitler's invasion is brutal. Many people believed that the Soviet Union was actually going to fall.
Somewhere between about 27 and 30 million people in the Soviet Union died. The vast majority are civilians, which tells you the nature of the German war effort. It's not a regular war. This is a war of extermination. It's a war of blood.
But the Soviets fight back, fueled by the biggest draft in history.
This war is not an ordinary war. It is the war of the entire Russian people.
Before the end of World War II, almost 30 million troops will be drafted to serve in the Red Army. That's one new soldier for every person lost to Hitler's invasion.
A lot of young men weren't properly trained, didn't have proper uniforms. They had bad equipment. They were taken from their villages and just said, okay, you're going to the front line now. You have to fight because we need you.
In June of 1944, with his army now replenished and the Western Allies' invasion of Europe underway, it's time for Stalin to strike in the east.
Bagration is Stalin's plan for the Great Summer Offensive of 1944, the largest, bar none, single Allied campaign in World War II.
On D-Day, the Western Allies' invasion force numbered approximately 155,000. But that's nothing compared to the number Stalin has. He begins his race to Berlin with a force more than 10 times bigger.
Stalin gets together over 2.3 million men. We're talking thousands of tanks, thousands of trucks, thousands of aircraft. It's absolutely massive. Hitler, by this point, has around about 1 million troops on the Eastern Front. They're setting up this horrific defense that the Soviets are going to have to go through.
Stalin's problem isn't the number of men he's got, but how to hide the fact that he's got so many. The goal? Catch the Germans off guard.
What Stalin wants is to try and hide from the Germans that, there is this storm of steel coming their way.
To keep 2.3 million men a secret, it's going to take Stalin's secret weapon, Maskirovka.
Maskirovka is a Russian word for disguise or deceit. Stalin does a number of things in order to deceive Hitler, having fake radio signals, having fake army groups, which don't really exist.
Stalin's ploy is to make it appear the attack will come in the Ukraine, when he actually plans to attack further north, in Belarusia.
Hitler, of course, was no military strategist. The Germans are duped. They move huge numbers of German tanks to the south, and that left them virtually defenseless.
Stalin is about to find out just how long he can keep his 2.3 million men a secret.
The Germans had laid these vast minefields on their front in order to prevent the Soviets from coming through.
In the dead of night, on the Belarusian front, 21-year-old Pyotr Mikhaev slips between trees, careful not to make a sound.
The work that Pyotr and his team are doing is incredibly dangerous. Deactivating minefields in preparation for the invasion of Bagration.
Pyotr clips barbed wire and pulls it away, creating a safe channel for troops in the rear to move through.
These young men had to crawl out into these minefields and very, very carefully try and find out where they were and then deactivate them by taking them apart. To do it in the dead of night, where you can't see anything, you can't communicate, you don't know where the mines are, was enormously dangerous work.
Many of Pyotr's brothers-in-arms will be killed in the attempt. But by the time they are done their work, the front has been cleared for Stalin's surprise assaults. Hitler is still none the wiser. But how much time does Stalin have before he is? Vasily Yermolenko is on the front line, ready for the attack. Like every Soviet soldier, after 3 years of fighting for survival, he's exhausted, physically and mentally. Even his boots are falling apart.
And yet, Bagration comes along, and this gives them all this tremendous boost of hope. Because finally, this is the chance that they're going to actually be able to show the Germans what they've got.
On June 22nd, it begins.
Battle begins early in the morning, and it begins with artillery barrage. So these guns that have been lined up all the way down for kilometers, all of a sudden start to fire.
32,000 pieces of artillery open up on German defenses, firing a total of 192,000 metric tons of ordnance.
The Germans are just all of a sudden faced with this massive barrage pounding down on them. And the Germans don't know what hit them because they weren't expecting this at all, and then they become terrified.
After the artillery, the Red Army, Yermolenko included, surges forward.
Waves and waves of troops smashing into the Germans. They scramble and try to fight back, but it really doesn't help. They start to surrender. And this is such a moment of triumph for the Red Army soldiers. It's a complete and utter victory for the Soviets from the moment go. Stalin's Maskirovka is so successful, it takes 3 days before Hitler realizes he's made this enormous error of judgment.
3 days is all it takes to give Stalin the advantage he needs. All along the Eastern Front, the Red Army pushes into occupied territory, rapidly gaining ground. Stalin takes back all the territory he's lost since 1941, and then some.
Bagration is the most territory gained in the shortest period of time in all of World War II. So in the span of about 2 months, they make it all the way to Poland.
The Germans suffer 350,000 casualties, over 40% of their defending forces.
It's absolutely staggering how successful Bagration is, to Hitler's absolute fury. And Stalin, of course, is jubilant. Finally, there's a sense of retribution, a sense of revenge.
By August of 1944, the Red Army has advanced 400 miles, more than halfway to the German capital. The Western Allies, meanwhile, have only made it 150 miles towards Berlin.
The Allies get stalled in France. People often think, June 7th, the day after D-Day, it's all over. It's not over. The Allies had a tough goal.
Advantage, Stalin. But he's paid for the lead in blood. His Red Army suffers over 770,000 casualties, while the Western Allies suffer just over 226,000. There's a quote famously attributed to Stalin: "One death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths, a statistic."
The bottom line is that Stalin doesn't care how many people die. All he cares about is winning.
Commanding the Western Front, Eisenhower has been taking a more measured approach on the road to Berlin than Stalin.
In terms of character, in terms of personality, you almost couldn't find two people more opposite. Because Eisenhower is very cautious, he's very concerned with the welfare of his own men and women.
After the success of D-Day, the Western Allied armies get bogged down by heavy German resistance in Normandy.
Allied bombing, followed by overwhelming forces, is what actually breaks them. And the American forces burst their way through that hole.
The Western advance is finally picking up steam, and Eisenhower is hoping to make up ground in the race to Berlin. But at a time when any delay counts, he's got a problem in Paris. 20,000 problems, actually. Paris has been under Nazi occupation for 4 years, and the more than 2 million citizens want the Germans gone. Eisenhower, though, has other ideas.
In the pre-invasion planning, Eisenhower had never had any intention of fighting for Paris. The plan was to bypass Paris.
It's not a major military objective for the Allies. It's only in French minds that Paris is important.
With the Germans' attention on the Allied invasion, the French resistance make their move.
There is this uprising by the French resistance that starts on the 19th of August, 1944.
It's a bit of a ragtag army, armed with whatever they can get their hands on, but it's quite sizable.
The resistance has up to 20,000 fighters determined to help liberate Paris, which puts their numbers on par with German occupiers. But they only have 600 guns, one for every 33 fighters. Despite being badly outgunned, the resistance have the backing of the people of Paris. But the Germans don't back down.
Hitler is insisting they fight for every yard. And so it's quite vicious fighting, and there are a number of casualties.
Eisenhower and his generals have been keeping an eye on Paris and the rising body count. 2,000 Parisians and 800 resistance fighters killed, thousands more wounded. But diverting troops from the front line to help risks stalling their advance to Berlin.
Very quickly becomes clear that they simply can't let this turn into a kind of bloodbath. They're gonna have to do something about it. Eisenhower says, yes, okay, we'll send in the troops.
2 days later, Allied troops enter Paris, and the tide of the uprising turns in favor of the resistance. But there's still one more wrong left to right. When the Germans first took Paris in 1940, they ordered a French firefighter to hang a swastika from the top of the Eiffel Tower. He complied, but swore he would take it down one day. Redemption is never easy. For Lucien Sarneguet, it will take 1,671 steps. August 25th, the battle for Paris is raging. The city is in chaos, but Sarneguet is singularly focused.
He's kept a tricolor, the red, white, and blue flag of France, since the surrender back in 1940. And he sees this opportunity to raise the tricolor on the very top of the Eiffel Tower.
Sarneguet and 3 fellow firefighters rush to the base of the Eiffel Tower. As the 4 men begin to climb the 1,000-foot-tall tower, the Germans open fire.
There was heavy fighting. Germans were shooting at him. And then he saw another team of Frenchmen doing the exact same thing. So it became kind of a foot race.
Sarneguet rushes to close the distance. Gasping for breath, the 45-year-old reaches the last of the tower's 1,671 steps to see his competition raising their own tricolor in place of the swastika. Sarneguet swore he'd be the one to do it, but in the moment of seeing the French flag flying once again, his disappointment gives way to elation. It was never about him. This was about France.
You're not just raising one flag, you're taking down the flag of your oppressor. So in a way, that raising of the tricolor on the Eiffel Tower is the moment that Paris is liberated.
The remaining German troops surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. But the liberation of Paris has cost the Western Allies time, putting them even further behind the Soviets in the race to Berlin. Which means Stalin, already ahead of the game, has 63 days to kill. At the start of August 1944, Stalin's Red Army is approaching the Vistula River. Just on the other side, Warsaw. Just like the Parisians, the Polish Home Army thinks liberty is at hand, and they rise up against the German occupiers in Warsaw. But to the surprise of the Home Army fighters and the Germans, the Red Army stops 6 miles outside the city and doesn't budge.
The Russian army is ordered to stay put. There's no reason why they couldn't have helped. It was the malice of Stalin, not wanting to spend his forces for Poland.
Warsaw is abandoned. For the residents, the number 13 represents their last hope of escape.
Civilians can't get out, so they're just simply massacred by bombing and by shell fire.
Girl Scout Anna Kowalski may only be 13 years old, but she is no stranger to combat.
The AK, the Polish Home Army, was very much a young people's movement made up of people in their teens and early 20s. And this included young Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. They worked as couriers, hid things in their houses. They daubed graffiti on the walls in the aid of the resistance movement.
Throughout the uprising, Anna has been an essential courier, dodging German gunfire and leaping barricades. Now she has her most difficult task, 40 feet below the city, in a river of filth.
The Home Army have used the sewer system in Warsaw throughout the Warsaw Uprising to move around the city underground. Girl Scouts, who of course were very small, very slim, could work in the sewers, and they were the ones who actually mapped out the routes through the sewers.
Desperate to escape German artillery, Anna leads people in groups of 50 through the maze of tunnels. Below, it's almost pitch black. Some lose consciousness because of the smell and have to be carried, and for those carrying them, the journey takes 5 hours. At last, they reach the exit manhole, gasping for fresh air. Behind them, Warsaw burns, and just across the river, the Red Army watches it all happen. In 3 days, over 5,000 Poles escape bombardment before the sewer entrance is destroyed. But thousands more are left behind to face Nazi wrath.
In the end, after 63 days, the Germans have managed to take Warsaw, fiercely crushing the Warsaw Uprising.
All this time, the Red Army remains effectively at a standstill. For Stalin, it's a calculated risk. He can kill 2 birds with 1 pause, allow the Red Army to resupply before the push to Berlin, and also set the stage for his post-war ambitions.
Politically, it's in Stalin's interest to see the destruction of Warsaw. Stalin's making it very clear what he wants out of this war, and he wants Central and Eastern Europe to be under Soviet control.
He wanted to eliminate Polish resistance to make sure that the resistance that the Soviets would face was gone.
But those 63 days waiting for the Warsaw Uprising to fail risks losing Stalin his lead in the race to Berlin. Because at the other end of Europe, the Western Allies are making headway.
From the moment they capture Paris, suddenly the race is on. You know, they're charging through northern France and eastern France.
By mid-September 1944, the Western Allies have advanced through France and Belgium to the doorstep of Germany's western border, 340 miles from Berlin. But they are about to face their greatest challenge yet, the Siegfried Line.
The Siegfried Line is a series of German defenses west of the River Rhine. This is a major, major obstacle that the Allies face.
Built over 3 years, from 1936 to 1939, the Siegfried Line is more than 390 miles long, but has only one purpose: to stop anyone from getting into Germany alive. It has 22,000 bunkers. The defenses go almost 20 miles deep. It has never been breached. But there might be a way through, and one number, 69, holds the key. Eisenhower's methodical advance has kept his forces relatively safe up to now, but has him trailing Stalin in the race to Berlin, a fact that frustrates Winston Churchill.
Churchill believed that getting to Berlin quickly and ahead of Stalin is really very, very important.
The British Prime Minister pressures Ike to gamble on a shortcut.
There is a gap in the Siegfried Line, which is in northern Holland. That gives you the chance to burst through into Germany to try and get to Berlin by Christmas.
It's Highway 69, but that route requires capturing key bridges in a risky lightning strike in order to secure a path across the River Rhine.
Eisenhower didn't like the plan, and that leads to a significant military debate between the Allies. But war isn't always about military strategy. It's often about political strategy, too.
In the end, Eisenhower agrees to roll the dice with the largest airborne operation in history.
Operation Market Garden is the Allied effort to try and force a way through around the northern edge of the Siegfried Line.
On September 17th, 34,600 men are airlifted into combat in an attempt to break through German lines. But after only 8 days, the Allies suffer 17,000 casualties and are forced to withdraw.
Market Garden was a giant gamble, and it failed. And it caused sizable losses for the Allies.
Highway 69 gains the nickname Hell's Highway. Eisenhower took a risk and it cost him. Now he knows they can't go around the Siegfried Line. If the Allies want to get to Berlin, they'll have to go through it.
The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest is just one of a series of battles that takes place all along the Siegfried Line.
It's one of the most heavily defended spots on the line. 54 square miles of dense woods, deep ravines, and high ridges. And the Western Allies' biggest enemy? A 100-foot-tall pine tree times several million.
The whole Allied way of war is to use firepower, tanks, and vast amounts of artillery. But in a dense pine forest, how do you do that? The infantry have got to actually gain the ground.
November 14th, 1944. 20-year-old Private Floyd A. Fulmer advances through the thick forest. Everything is silent. As he inches forward, he is surrounded by the bodies of those who came before him, reminding him of just how deadly this place is. Suddenly, the trees come alive with gunfire, mowing down the men as they stumble and dive for cover. Fulmer scrambles to make it to a foxhole, but it's too late. He's hit. His body drops lifeless to the ground. The rest of his squad is forced into retreat. In the chaos, Fulmer's body must be abandoned. Afterwards, he is listed as missing and presumed dead. One more fallen soldier in a forest filling up with them. By the end of the Hurtgen Forest campaign, on December 16th, 1944, an army of 120,000 will suffer 33,000 casualties, a rate of 27.5%.
We look back on these things and we say, well, eventually they won, but we often forget that it came at significant cost.
In all, the Siegfried Line will cost the Western Allies 250,000 casualties and stall their advance on Berlin for months. In the east, Stalin watches as the Germans divert more troops to the Western Front. And he knows his day will come, a day marked on his calendar by the number 1. By the end of December 1944, the Red Army has been standing down for 5 months outside of Warsaw. But they've been busy with a massive logistical buildup: 132,000 carloads of supplies, 9 million rounds of ammunition, 30 million gallons of fuel.
Stalin starts to build up the supplies in preparation for this winter offensive. And Stalin is just determined to push as far westward as he possibly can.
January 12th, 1945, the Red Army is on the march again. For 3 weeks, they drive unrelentingly through Poland towards Germany and bowl over the depleted Nazi defenses with their vastly superior numbers.
There's about a 5-to-1 discrepancy between the Germans and the Soviets by this point.
295,000 German troops are killed in 3 weeks. That's an astonishing 14,000 every single day. By January 31st, the Red Army has covered 270 miles to the banks of the Oder River.
That thrust through Poland is everything for the Russians. Then basically you're right on the German doorstep.
The Red Army now sits only 40 miles from the finish line in Berlin.
As you get closer and closer to Berlin, the German soldiers start to fight more and more and more ferociously.
Facing fierce resistance, Stalin pauses the Soviet advance once more. He wants to make sure his Red Army can crush the Germans on their home turf.
He wants to consolidate their forces and to build them up for that last thrust into Germany.
February on the Western Front. The Allies are finally past the Siegfried Line, battling their way into German cities and towns on the banks of the River Rhine. By the end of March, they've crossed the Rhine and are into the German heartland.
In March 1945, it's clear to Eisenhower that Hitler doesn't have a hope of winning. In most wars, usually people surrender when they're not going to win.
But Hitler has no intention of surrendering. He's insisting his army defend to the last man standing. So, with Berlin just 175 miles away, Eisenhower changes focus.
His primary objective is, of course, to deliver victory to the Allied forces, but he wants to make sure that the goal is achieved without dramatic losses or as few losses as is possible. That now becomes the paramount goal, not the race to Berlin.
Eisenhower decides it's better to isolate Berlin, cut off the enemy's supply lines, and slowly suffocate the remaining German resistance. But he'll need Stalin to go along with this plan.
Eisenhower sends his telegram to Stalin on the 28th of March, 1945. You know, he's a pretty straightforward, honest kind of guy. And I suppose his hope is that by being straight with Stalin, Stalin will be straight with him.
Eisenhower wrote the telegram to assure Stalin his intentions, that an American thrust to Berlin would be a waste of time and effort, and all they had to do was basically wait it out.
Now, Stalin gets this telegram, and he's absolutely thrilled. He says, yes, yes, we absolutely agree. We don't think that Berlin is a particularly important strategic point anymore either. And then the first thing he does after answering the telegram is to call together his generals and to figure out how they're going to take Berlin as quickly as possible.
It's April 1st, April Fool's Day. Eisenhower has made the mistake of underestimating Stalin's willingness to sacrifice Soviet lives to get what he wants. And the next date on Stalin's calendar? May 1st. The final push to Berlin will involve over 2 million Soviet troops, 6,250 tanks, and 41,000 pieces of artillery. More than 750,000 German troops stand between them and the German capital. On April 15th, the assault begins. 1.2 million shells rain down on the first day. After 9 days of intense fighting, Red Army troops have surrounded Berlin. They swarm into the city. Their goal? The Reichstag, the traditional seat of the German government.
They're like locusts. I mean, it is carnage, destruction, death, mayhem, everywhere you look.
The race to Berlin has been run for 11 months and 700 miles. But the last 1,200 feet takes 7 hours to cross. April 30th, 1945. 20-year-old Kazakh Lieutenant Rahimjan Koshkabayev and his comrade Grigory Bulatov take cover.
The battle is raging around the Reichstag. The Germans are fiercely defending it, and these two young men who've been fighting for such a long time have a very precious cargo with them.
2 men carry a Soviet flag. Their orders are that the flag must hang from the Reichstag by May 1st, International Workers' Day. Exactly the kind of political home run Stalin is looking for.
They're sneaking toward the Reichstag. There's sniper fire, there's rifle fire, there's shrapnel going off, but they manage to get inside.
Heavy German resistance pushes back at them as they ascend the steps. By the time they get safely to the top, night has fallen. They complete their mission in the dark with just over 3 hours to spare, hanging the flag and officially declaring a winner in the race to Berlin at 8:40 p.m. on April 30th, 1945.
They were going to take pictures of this flag waving above the Reichstag. But the problem was, of course, by this point it was dark and the image didn't work and nobody really sees it. And so they wrap the flag back up again and retreat.
The race began with gunshots over Utah Beach. It ends with a gunshot as well. A few hours before the Soviet flag is planted on the Reichstag, 28 feet underground, Adolf Hitler puts a gun to his head and pulls the trigger. By the end of the Battle of Berlin, Soviet casualties stand at 81,000 dead or missing. The Germans have lost at least 100,000. Stalin has the victory he craved, but it isn't enough. He needs the world to see it.
It's the photograph of the guy on the Reichstag that's important to Stalin. However, it's not until the 2nd of May when they reenact the moment that the famous picture of the young soldier reaching out and putting the flag up on the Reichstag is actually photographed.
One last deception from the master, Joseph Stalin, the unqualified winner of the race to Berlin, even if he was one day late.
Stalin's getting to Berlin first is a great propaganda coup which bolsters his own image in the Soviet Union.
It's a glorious moment for the Russians and for Stalin personally, but it's wasteful. You commit tens of thousands of boys to their graves in order to hoist a flag.
For Stalin, it's just one more small sacrifice for victory and glory.
Stalin wins the race for Berlin because he wants it more than the Allies and because he's prepared to sacrifice more of his men to achieve it. It is absolutely unquestionably the Eastern Front where the most blood is spilled.
Over 50% of all German casualties took place within these last 12 months of the war. And 80% of those casualties were on the Eastern Front. The Western Allies faced 25% of the German army. The Soviets faced 75%. The Soviet Union lost more than 15% of its population, but they won the race. And for Stalin, much more.
In a way, World War II sealed the power of Stalin and his regime. And he's got pretty well everything east of Berlin and also East Germany.
An iron curtain split Europe.
Stalin had his glory, his territory, and a stranglehold on Europe, from which to maintain Soviet control for decades to come.